Good morning, seventh graders. A little bit more of your Utah history. We're going to have a lecture today. Yes, I have a gas mask on and a helmet because we're in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic and there was an earthquake yesterday. So I am prepared for anything today, pretty much, except for a normal day. That would catch me by surprise. But since it's hard to talk in this, I'll take it off. Take this off. Oh, hope I don't get sick. All right. Okay, I got to move fast because YouTube only takes certain length videos. So we're going to talk and review a little bit of chapters 4 through 6 in your Utah history book. And so we're going to hit the ground running, so pay attention. Okay, first European here in Utah, 1765, Juan Rivera. He came up along the east side of what became the state of Utah and didn't stay very long, but he's the first white person. Then, of course, a few years later, 1776, the Spanish wanted to establish a trail between Santa Fe and Monterey, California, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and they sent Fathers Dominguez and Escalante, the most famous expedition, and they, of course, crossed Utah. They came by Mount Timpanogos and Utah Lake, and they were the first ones to meet the Utes. So they established that. The Spanish did eventually establish the old Spanish Trail. It traveled from Santa Fe to Los Angeles, and it went pretty much through central and southwestern Utah. Well, there was a little bit of a break there before other white people arrived, and black people as well. And they were the mountain men. They were looking for furs, especially the fur of the beaver pelts. So they came out from St. Louis, lived in the mountains year-round. They were provided with traps and other necessary equipment by the companies that they worked for. And every year during the summer, they had what was called a rendezvous, where they would turn in their pelts, and then they would get their supplies for the following year. They lived in and among the Indians. Many of them got along fine. Some of them married into the tribes. James Beckworth, the famous black trapper, he actually was adopted by the Crow Indians and was a Crow war chief. He married a Crow woman. And so that's James Beckworth. Peter Skeen Ogden worked for the Hudson's Bay Company up in the Pacific Northwest, and he came down to trap out as many beaver as possible. He discovered the Ogden River and, of course, the town of Ogden, and the Ogden River named after him. Jim Bridger was actually an American. Ogden was not an American, but Bridger was. And Bridger came in along the Bear Lake and Bear River area, floated down in a bull boat, and ran into a big lake that was salty, and he assumed it was the Pacific Ocean. Only later did he figure out that it was not the Pacific, that it was actually a lake. So Jim Bridger is the first white person to see the Great Salt Lake. Another famous mountain man, Jedediah Smith, came through our area as well. On his way to California, he helped find a lot of the trails that went to California. He eventually was killed by the Indians. Etienne Provost. Etienne Provost was a French trapper. He came out, and he came out to Utah Lake, that area down there, and Provo, Utah is named after him, and the Provo River is named after him. Okay? So, yeah, those are the famous ones. Later came, actually, let me just tell you that the fashions changed, and the beaver was saved from extinction, basically because of that. And so that was the end of the Mountain Man era, probably in the early 1840s, early to mid-1840s. A lot of them became guides on the Oregon Trail and so forth. Government explorers came next. John C. Fremont and John Gunnison are the two famous ones. Fremont came through this area, mapped it. They were scientists, so they explored geology, zoology, botany, ethnology. They made maps, measured the height of the mountains and all that. So Fremont actually published books that influenced Brigham Young later on about the valley. John Gunnison helped survey and figure out where the best route for the railroad was. Unfortunately, Gunnison was killed by Indians. So that's a quick summary of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Joseph Smith, as a young boy, had a vision in the woods of upstate New York And later, he was made a prophet by the Lord, according to Latter-day Saint teachings. He was shown some plates, golden plates, dug those up, showed where they were, dug them up, and he and a friend translated them, and it became the Book of Mormon. It was published in 1830. So he began to gather converts, and they wanted to go to a gathering place. They had unusual beliefs for Christians, and so the surrounding Christians didn't really like them. So they decided to leave New York. They settled in Kirtland, Ohio, but they were not real popular there after a while, so they decided to move to Independence, Missouri, that area there. And eventually the Missouri governor issued an extermination order, so they were forced to flee Missouri. They went to Illinois and established the city of Nauvoo. Built a beautiful temple there. In the process, they were there a few years, but eventually they made a lot of enemies because there were a lot of Mormons who were moving into the area, and the surrounding people were afraid they would politically take over. So Joseph Smith and Hyrum were arrested, sent to the jail at Carthage in 1844, and a mob stormed the building and killed him. So the next people the next leader to be established was a man by the name of Brigham Young. And he decided it was time to get out of town. And so he organized the Mormon people to leave Nauvoo, most of them, and head west of the Rocky Mountains into the Great Salt Lake Valley. It took a couple of years to get everything together. In the meantime, in 1846, the United States went to war with Mexico, and the U.S. asked the Mormons to provide a battalion of soldiers. So the Mormon battalion was organized, and they were important because they showed that the Mormons were loyal American citizens and that they could send their money home because they got paid, so they could send their money to help in the migration or emigration out of the United States into the Great Salt Lake Valley. So Brigham Young in 1847 organized the Advanced Pioneer Company. They traveled across basically the Oregon Trail to Fort Bridger. They headed southwest to the Salt Lake Valley. Brigham Young said this is the right place. And the advance party arrived July 22nd, 1847, the first couple of guys. And then on July 24th, which is Pioneer Day, is when Brigham Young arrived. Other groups followed. Thousands actually began to follow over the next few years, and basically the routine was they would hear a horn in the morning, they would get ready, cook their breakfast, get their wagons ready, and so forth. If they didn't have any wood, they used buffalo droppings called buffalo chips. In other words, dried buffalo poop, which is really glorified grass. The animals of choice were oxen and mules. They also had horses. Oxen were preferred because they were really tough. And they traveled, 10 to 15 miles a day, basically. Midday, it was called nooning. They would stop for lunch. And so ultimately, they every break they took was called nooning. They slept outside or in tents. Sometimes they slept under the wagons, but they'd set up tents. They didn't sleep in the wagons. Their biggest threats were disease, accidents, especially with little kids, and occasionally the Indians would get violent. But ordinarily the Indians would just raid and steal things and charge tolls to cross rivers and things like that. So the first group arrived and began to build Salt Lake City. So that was a brief look at Chapter 5. Chapter 6, more and more Latter-day Saints came. There were a lot of converts coming from Europe and other places, and they were poor. So the church established the Perpetual Emigrant Fund to help bring the people to Zion, as they called it. So the people were supposed to borrow the money and pay it back when they got jobs and stuff in Salt Lake City. About 3,000 Latter-day Saints came in hand carts. They actually were too poor to have wagons, so the church had them bring hand carts, and it worked for a while, but the Martin and Willie companies were in Wyoming, and they got a late start, and they got caught in the snow. 280 people died. It's the biggest disaster of the trek, the Mormon trek across the continent there. Later, they came up with the idea of down and back wagons. where they actually would supply the wagons. And Utah boys, young boys, would drive them as teamsters so they could meet the pretty young girls, which is pretty cool. All right, so they would pick up the immigrants and bring them back. A lot of immigrants came by boat, by ship. They would either come to the East Coast and work their way across to Utah, or they'd come by ship to California and work their way across. Sometimes they ran into swindlers who faked them out and took their money, which was really pretty tragic. So let's see what a Utah town looked like at the time. Well, the streets were laid out in a grid pattern like they still are today, north, south, east, and west. They were very wide, okay, so that oxen could turn around with wagons. There were large city blocks, 4 acres or more, with large gardens for the houses. Public buildings and so forth, church houses, were sort of in the center of the towns, as was like parks and areas for celebrations. And then farmland lay outside the cities. They didn't stay in Salt Lake City long. They began to move out. Brigham Young would call people to go elsewhere, and each new town had a specific job to do. Cedar City, for instance, down south, produced iron. St. George produced cotton and flax. Sugar House produced molasses and sugar, thus the name. There were Indian missions, one of which, ironically, was Las Vegas, which is kind of weird. Ordinarily, people would be willing to go if Brigham Young called them. It was voluntary, but they could go. And when they were called to establish a new settlement, they would do it. And that's how many of the towns along the Wasatch Front from Idaho all the way down almost to Arizona were created. And there were towns created in Idaho and Arizona and as far north as Canada and down into Mexico. The Cache Valley up by Logan was established as the granary of Utah. The railroad came through finally, and the Golden Spike was driven May 10th, 1869. And so Utah was now connected. Utah Territory was now connected to the rest of the country. Obviously, a lot of non-Mormons came. Many of them came to build the railroad and to mine because gold and other minerals had been discovered. And so mining towns sprang up, such as Alta, Bingham, and Park City. Many people of many different religions and no religions at all came through, and a lot of them built their own towns because they didn't want to live under the rule of the Mormons. Through the 1880s and 90s, more and more people arrived and spread out, many of them from Europe, some from Hawaii. The little town of Yosepa in the Skull Valley, 45 minutes from here, was established for Hawaiians. And the last Mormon company arrived in 1913. Now, the rest of the story. There was a thing called the Mormon War, or the Utah War, that took place in the 1850s when the government sent troops out here to make sure the Mormons were not in rebellion. Nobody was killed. There were no battles. It proved that it put the Mormons into a bit of a panic. During that time period, a train of immigrants was going through down in southern Utah, wagon train. And they were wiped out. They were killed by the Mormons down there at a place called Mountain Meadows Massacre. Only small children survived. There were arrests that were made, but only one man was executed. Brigham Young opposed it. When he found out later, he was totally devastated by it. He couldn't believe that it had happened. Polygamy was the big problem. For statehood, Congress did not want the Mormon polygamists to be a state. So in the 1890s, they passed laws preventing polygamy, and many Mormon men were arrested. Finally, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints dropped the idea of polygamy. So today, for instance, Mormon men are not allowed to marry more than one woman. And in 1896, Utah became a state. 1898, Utah helped in the Spanish-American War. 1917 and 18, the World War I. 1941 to 45, World War II. The Candy Bomber, 1948, during the Berlin airlift. He got famous. 1950s, the Cold War. Some military bases were established. Let's see what else. 1950s and 60s, the interstate highways came through. More and more railroads and more people. The year 2002 was the Olympics. And so that basically summarizes kind of really quick the history of Utah. And hope you guys listen to this and go through it a couple of times. There's some pretty important points. Okay, thanks a lot, and have a good day. Bye.